So the first question I have is, what did I do to John to have to go after Win? Win was amazing. Can we give him another round of applause? Absolutely incredible. I don't know what's better, Liza Minnelli, Hank William Jr., or Blackouts and Bob Marley. I mean, how do I go after that? That was just incredible. So this morning, we're going to talk a little bit about the evolution of the CISO and the transition that a lot of us are making from being technical to being more transformational. And so I'm Kate Kuehn, and to give you a little bit of background on myself, I have been a CISO, a CEO, I'm on board of directors, I'm a board advisor, I've been a CRO, and I'm a mom of 5, which means that, you know, I have to matrix manage everything in my world. But let me talk a little bit about how I started to develop board experience, because it goes into the fact that we kind of have to think about this journey, this transition, from the fact that from a technical perspective as CISOs, our world is always changing very, very rapidly. From a board perspective and a business perspective, the same fundamental principles that guide a board, that guide a CEO, have been instilled in businesses for hundreds of years. So, I love being back in the Midwest. I am from Oconomowoc, Wisconsin, and my family ran Wisconsin Cold Storage, Wiscold, which was a publicly traded company in Wisconsin. And I tell that because one of my earliest memories was having to dress up in a little white dress with patent leather shoes because the CEO of then Marine Bank, which is now Chase Bank, JP Morgan, was coming to see my grandfather. Now, why would the CEO of Marine Bank be coming to see my grandfather? Why? So, my grandfather had found out about this thing called the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, and he had decided to trade, love being in Iowa, pork belly futures when they came out onto the market. Everybody's smiling. Pork belly, why pork belly? Well, he had made a killing in the pork belly markets. So much so, he bought a sailboat and named it Dreamer. But the president of the bank had to come to dinner at the family house because he might have used company funds to do the trading, and he had to have a discussion with him about using publicly traded company funds for personal gain. And that he was going to have a discussion with the board of directors on this. Now, thankfully, the board of directors were my father and my uncle and a bunch of other people, but it was my first experience of having corporate responsibility in a publicly traded company, there in my little black shoes, smiling nicely at the nice man who I had to talk to, and smiling, you know, be good to the president. Fast forward a little bit. In my 20s, I went to Oxford University. And one of my dad's best friends, again, tiny little Wiscold, you know, we froze smelt and John Deere products and corn. But one of my dad's best friends owned a cold storage in New Zealand. And it was his fun thing. His main job was he was the chairman of John Swire & Sons, which was Cathay Airlines. And I wish I were kidding you, Sir Edward Scott, when I was at Oxford, asked if I wanted to see what a board meeting was like. Sure, why not? I'm in my 20s, it'd be kind of fun. So I went to London, and I got to sit on a board meeting for John Swire & Sons. And here's the interesting thing. The board spent an hour and a half debating whether to put in computers into the airline terminals to help understand flight paths. Think about that. Whether they should put computers in, because they weren't sure that there was enough technical viability and it would actually make an impact, and should they spend the investment. So it had nothing to do with the security. It had nothing to do with whether or not this was going to improve. It was a financial question about, was it going to address the risk that they had, that planes were being late because they didn't really know if they were on the right flight paths from the ground. It was a really, and what the board spent the most amount of time on was discussing whether or not the pension funds were correct, which, you know, that makes a lot more sense. But it was my first time of really understanding that how a board looks at risk is very, very different than how we as technologists may see it. So You know, when we start to think about the world today and this transition, we are in a world of change. You know, you think about, we've had a lot of political upheaval, we've got war going on, we have a big disillusion of how the world order had been, and on top of it, we have an acceleration from the pandemic and from what we're seeing in the world as far how even we communicate. It's a huge amount of change. You know, we talk about IoT, is your toaster going to attack your refrigerator? We talk about nation-state attacks. Interesting thing is that true nation-state hacks are actually down. Fee-for-service, criminal groups, grabbing data from inside organizations and selling it to nation-states is actually on the rise. And the #1 export of traditional European, you know, the Eastern European countries, does anyone know what it is? Population control software. Think about that. It's also one of the #1 exports right now to China. So the world we live in is changing. And if we think about that from a CISO perspective, it's not unreasonable that when we're looking from a CISO or a board perspective, we seem to be talking different languages. So what's happening in the industry today? We all talk about how fast-paced it is. I'm loving the fact of whether or not we all agree on this. Today we're dealing with cloud, right? Everyone thinks about zero trust, yeah. Is it the biggest buzzword in our industry right now? Did I maybe name my baby's Twitter account after it? Yeah. We think about customer experience. Did we ever think 5 years ago that we would be getting our groceries from a delivery service? That we would be thinking about, from a pandemic perspective, how we create a better online digital experience? Would we consider that supply chain would be one of our biggest concerns from a skill shortage perspective? There are over 4 million jobs that have not been replaced yet because of the pandemic. And that security and privacy would continue to be tantamount. Here's the interesting thing is, look at some of these statistics. Customer experience, skills shortage, cloud, zero trust. This is our world today, right? Changes all the time. But let's take a look back. So when I started prepping for this presentation, I went back and looked at one I did 10 years ago. As I thought maybe, you know, it'd be interesting to compare the changes, see where we've come from. Guess what? We actually haven't changed that much. So 10 years ago I gave this presentation, and look what I'm thinking. Cloud, 58% were moving to cloud. In the last slide it was 30% are still considering cloud. So guess what, we've got about a 20% variable in 10 years. 28% are looking at regulation, still something we think about. Threat landscape, still there. But if you look at the numbers and the percentages on the side, 10 years ago, I was talking about 7 jobs for every qualified candidate, still the skill shortage. 97% of Fortune 500 companies have been breached in that year, and 48% of CEOs didn't know where spending was. So while we as CISOs think our world is rapidly changing, the reality is the themes we've dealt with from a technical perspective are the same. So remember when I said I was talking about the boards and, you know, my little Mary Janes, and that the things were kind of the same from a risk perspective? While we're constantly dealing with new and emerging threats, the themes of risk are the same. And that's when you start to think about, from a transformational perspective, how we need to start approaching coming together to a common language. So the first thing we want to talk about is perspective. This is the perspective of a CEO when you're being a CEO. And having been one, I'll tell you, it is like this. And I love the fact it's out of focus, because this is kind of how your day is you're trying to deal with 55,000 things. You have competitive pressures, you have customer pressures, you have industry pressures, technology, trends, best practices, economic. And it's really, really tiring. But think about that. Technology is only one thing that factors in. Now risk, though, factors into all of it. One of my favorite things was, I remember we were in the middle of a big breach when I was a CEO, and we were trying to figure out how we were going to help a customer, and it was incredibly important. And my board called and said, we have a really big issue. We are very concerned that we might have a lawsuit on our hands. And I was like, what What are you talking about? And I'm thinking it's because of the breaches and what we're doing, and she's like, no, 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 no. The board wants to meet because one of your employees wants an infrared sauna for wellness and is threatening to sue us if we don't get her a sauna. Huh? Huh? We got a breach going on. I'm going to get sued because of a sauna? Yeah. Very different risk factors, very different focus. And sometimes I think as technologists, we forget all of the different things that our brethren in the C-suite have to deal with. So what's the perspective from a CISO perspective? We think of it from what are the type of attack vectors? What are the risks to the business? Are we dealing with ransomware? I love the fact ransomware is still front and center, but it's slowing down. We're seeing things like supply chain attack, different types of man-in-the-middle attacks. How do we start to educate the board that it's not going to always be ransomware? Trojans, e-whaling, espionage, IP theft, disruptive cyber attacks. I don't see infrared saunas on here. How do we start to get a common language where we don't sound like Snoopy? You remember the wonderful wah, 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 wah? Yeah, that's the problem, is we have to create a common language. So a lot of times when I put my CISO hat on, I'll have my peers in the C-suite go, are we really under attack? Are we really at war? What does it look like? What should we be thinking about? And so I always steal this slide from my good friend Jackie Shard from GCHQ, because I think this is one of the best ways to think about a holistic attack. This is kind of what the average layman would think about. We have the war, we've got preparing for missions. How are we going to actually prepare our defenses? You know, how many ways are there to steal our data, disrupt our operations, impact our future capabilities? We're going to launch the missiles. Funny story. This week I was invited to the Atlantic Future Foundation. Anyone ever been? No? Great public-private consortium between the British and the US government. I got on a ferry boat, I got put on an aircraft carrier. Only cyber convention I've ever been to where they have displays of missiles and you get to stand next to a missile. It was a little freaky. But it shows this concept that we're at war. But the reality is the war we're fighting is because of our lack of culture, our lack of understanding of patterns of life, our lack of understanding digital footprint. How do we protect our number one asset, which is what? Our employees. So it's interesting when you start to think about, from a board perspective, and looking at a risk register, there are about 6 to 7, sometimes a little bit more, areas of risk a board focuses on. Operational, reputational, cyber, climate, all sorts of things. But the reality is that the number one impact on all areas of risk are your employees. And I think sometimes when we look at how we approach becoming transformational, we need to remember that the employees and the data they have access to are the number one thing we have to consider. So if you look at that last slide and you think about the attack surface from a war perspective, we like to think about military tactics. And military says, okay, we're going to protect the perimeter, right? We're going to build a moat. We're going to get our defenses in line. And we're going to put everything in the middle, and it's going to be protected because we have a really great perimeter. Well, that doesn't work anymore. We have to be able to think about it from an individual perspective. What is the most important data? How do we look at things from the inside out? And that's a huge shift to allow, when you think about from a board perspective, from a culture perspective, that we can't just protect the perimeter, but we have to protect the individual. So why is this important? 72% of employees use unauthorized files. Not a real shocking stat, but it is shocking in action. So I was on my way to FSI SAC a couple months ago in Orlando, and I sat down next to this lovely woman, and she had on cute little Jack Rogers sandals and a cute little Lily Pulitzer skirt, and she looked just like I do when I go and hang out with my kids next to the pool. So I complimented her shoes, we chatted about, our favorite brands, and I asked what she was doing, and she said, I'm flying to Orlando to have one last trip with my grandchildren before my husband and I have to go back to Texas because we're selling the company. We're dissolving our company. And I'm really kind of sad about it. I thought, oh, okay, so chatting. I was like, oh, why? Well, my husband is the largest concrete distributor in Dallas. Okay. And we had one of those, I think it's called ransomware attacks. And some group in Turkey took $2 million from us. And I was like, well, I'm in security. How did it happen? She goes, oh, my husband didn't realize. He grabbed one of the work files while he was on my phone. He just pulled it off Google Drive, and they were able to get in and get some passwords from my iPhone. So a hacking group in Turkey compromised the wife of the CEO's phone, was able to extort $2 million, and the board decided that between the cyber insurance payments, the increase in the cost, and the actual risk to the business, it was no longer financially viable to keep the company open, and they made the company get dissolved. Think about that. From one mistake on his wife's phone. Second thing, 1 in 7 of your employees is using adult gaming and access entertainment sites. So, for the security practitioners in the room, I'm going to get a little geeky for a minute. Who's heard of Red Drop? Anyone? Yeah, how did I know you would know it? Red Drop. Red Drop was a really kick-ass little piece of malware a couple years ago. And I had to give a couple talks on it when I was at a mobile security company, and it was always great to stand on stage and talk about Red Drop. Here's why. Red Drop was a Chinese piece of malware that would get injected into cell phones through a number of apps that were downloaded, from translators to dictionaries to games. But guess what their most successful app for infection was? Abby, I'm sorry, close your ears for a minute. Their Rub My Waitress app. Honest to God, it was an app, and you could rub and interact with pretty pictures of Chinese waitresses, and it would infect into your phone. Guess what it did? It would immediately screen capture anything on the phone and take photos. It would record all of your voice conversations, and then it paid for yourself by shipping everything to a Dropbox using high-priced SMS texts that then it would erase. So the only way you'd figure out you were infected about a month later is when you got like a $10,000 cell phone bill. So much fun. So can you imagine that you're the employee who's decided to very quietly download Rub My Waitress and have to go, one of the most successful pieces of Chinese malware at all time, have to go to your IT or your budgetary person and say, I'm really sorry that I have a $20,000 cell phone bill because I'm stupid. But that stupid person just had their phone recorded, all of their data, everything taken off of it. Mike, how did I know, my darling? How did I know? Now, imagine, as a mother of 5, having to give a presentation about Rub My Waitress, and oh, guess what? The next thing we're going to talk about. It's so much fun. We went from Rub Our Waitress to Wi-Fi and infected Wi-Fi hotspots. So, pandemic, everybody is working from home. Do we really think that everybody's got secure Wi-Fi? No. Am I proving my point that an employee is an attack surface? Yeah. These are some of the things we need to think about, that it's not perimeter anymore. It's really important to understand. Outdated iOS. And my favorite, apps leak sensitive credentials. So my favorite story about sensitive credentials is we're going to go from rubbing waitresses to the absolute opposite of pregnant mermaids. Huh? How do we go from rubbing waitresses to pregnant mermaids? So I come from a large family. My husband comes from a large family. My sister-in-law, honest to God, she is actually, she was, at the end of her career, a technologist. But in the beginning of her career, she wanted to see the world, so she was a long-haul truck driver. She was in the Army. She decided to see the world. For 6 years, she became a long-haul truck driver, got married, had a baby. Her daughter is the same age as my daughter, my youngest daughter, Kari. So we are sitting around one day, and she's like, oh my God, you have to get this game for Kari, it's the best. I'm like, well, what is it? She goes, it's called Pregnant Mermaid. I'm like, huh? She's like, they get to have a mermaid, and the mermaid gets to have a baby, and they get to raise a family, and it's this really cool thing. And I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? But I'm like, all right, I'm intrigued. So I'm a weird mom. Any app that I'm told to give my kids, I put it on my device first to see exactly what it's doing, and if I haven't heard of it before, and then I'll give it to the kids. So I throw this Pregnant Mermaid thing on my phone. Well, first of all, it starts asking me for permissions to my camera, my microphone. It's asking me for my Google credentials, and I'm like, oh, this could be fun. So I sandbox it, and I start to have a little fun with it. Well, 10 minutes into it, it's telling me that my mermaid needs an emergency C-section. And if I don't pay another $5, we're not sure that the mermaid's baby is going to be healthy. And maybe we need prenatal vitamins. For another click, that's another $3. So I did some research. The group that created this game was actually listed as one of the top apps for stealing credentials. And it would regenerate itself into a new program or a new name every 3 to 5 days on the Apple Store. Think about that. So as long as it just created a new name and a new profile, it would continue. But it had latent Trojans into it. So once the kid was hooked, a couple of hours later, it would start asking for money. And if you clicked, you were able to get more money. On average, it was stealing $300 to $500 per download. So these are just some examples of why understanding that in today's world, our connected digital economy, your employees really are your biggest attack surface when you think about the fact that data now, not the perimeter, not our brick and mortar culture, is what we need to think about. So how then do we create a common language with the board? Well, the first thing is to start giving a board an education on the full risk management picture. We all like to talk about the stories that there's criminal terrorism, nation state, and hacktivism. And, you know, we've all heard the things about the memory makers, WannaCry, NotPetya. We all know who Lazarus Group is. There's these major nation states, and there's these criminals, and there's hacktivists, and there's terrorism. I've had a lot of experience with terrorism. If you want me to talk about some of the precursors to Homeland and the last attack by Al-Qaeda on the financial networks, come see me. It's a lot of fun. But the reality is risk is actually our #1 thing from a threat landscape perspective. You have impact on customer requirements, press, legal, regulatory, and that's what makes up a board's risk register. If you think about what I talked about earlier, operational, reputational, this plays into it. But most C-levels and laymen outside our industry don't realize that while there's a lot of memory maker news and there's impact to your organizations from these 4 things, it's that center, it's that employee. It's 53+% risk comes from accident, lack of culture, awareness, not the other stuff. This is where you have to start creating a common language with your board. So how do we do that? Well, we all have to go on as individuals and organizations, the never-ending journey, the cyber journey. Where do we sit on this continuum? The cyber journey is something that we should be thinking about on how do we educate not only our boards, but every employee in an organization of where are they in understanding their role within protecting an organization. So we start with denial. I only use a computer once and twice a day. I'm the janitor. Why would I care? To worry, ooh, you know what, that guy down the hall got breached. Maybe I should put a password on and maybe change my password every once in a while. To false confidence, yes, our neighbor company got breached, our biggest competitor, but I spent $10 million on boxes that are sitting in a warehouse that somebody's going to be able to implement, and I'm going to have the best security ever. True story. 10 years ago, I got a phone call when I was at British Telecom as the CISO from a counterpart of mine. He's like, Kate, I don't know what I walked into. And I'm like, well, what do you mean? He goes, they had a breach, and they bought $10 million of gear, and it's sitting in a warehouse, and they don't know what to do with it. Can you come take a look and help me walk through this warehouse to figure out what the hell they bought? I'm like, sure. Every firewall, we had every Palo on there, we had Cisco stuff, we had everything under the sun. It was so outdated, we couldn't do anything with it. I'm like, you gotta throw the whole thing away, I don't know what to tell you. There's nothing here that's gonna work. Hard lessons, guess what? The breach happens again, to being a leader. So why I say every person has to kind of understand this is, as a CISO, you're gonna assess where your company is. But from a culture perspective, you have to get your employees and understand where they sit on the journey. Where do your C-levels sit? What is the actual temperature of your culture? So let me tell you about my journey. In my 20s, I worked for Verizon. I was a salesperson, somewhat technical. I knew a little bit. I could discuss fiber dispersion comp ratios. I was in this amazing world called converged packet access with the exchanges. And at 24 years old, I was at my folks' house in Shaniqua, Wisconsin. My dad's having dinner, and the phone rang. There had been a data center break-in in London. A data center break-in. Why am I getting the phone call? They're like, we think there's been a security breach. We want you on the phone with our security team because there's going to be fallout from the customer. I get on my computer to start looking at the emails, and my dad's dial-up is so slow that I can't get the data downloaded fast enough. So I have to drive to a hotel in Milwaukee, Wisconsin to have enough internet speed to actually get the real-time communications that are coming through. And what we figured out was that it was one of 200 breaches in data centers that had happened, break-ins, in the course of 10 months. Uh-oh, this is bad. It's not going to happen. Really, this isn't happening. So I fly to London in my little black heels, my little black suit. I'm walking roofs with Scotland Yard. Walking roofs with Scotland Yard at 24 years old. I'm not paid enough to do this. Really, seriously, I'm not. As we're looking at how the attackers rappelled down an elevator shaft and used magnetic door openers to get in. My first mentor in security was a guy by the name of Bill Dunn. And Bill, who was the original CISO of the CME group, was walking with me, and he always, for some reason, called me herself. And he said, herself, we got a problem here. I know that you're putting together a plan, that you're going to put 1-inch steel-enforced box around our gear, and that you've already, positioned a lock that's literally 5 inches big, I've got pictures of it, to, wall off our data center. But this is going to happen again, and I'm going to tell you why. Because I don't think you've actually educated your staff well enough. And the next time, these attackers have figured out that you guys are pretty late on understanding how they're going to come in. They're going to walk in the front door because after 10 o'clock, you have a security guard and a custodian, and they're going to hold a gun to somebody's head and they're coming in again. No, we're okay. I've got steel thickness on your data center gear. I've got a big, huge lock that's 5 inches big. We're okay. Yeah, I'll deal with the culture part later. Should I be a little worried? Maybe. 3 weeks later, that same attack group walked in the front door, held a gun to the security guard's head, tied up the custodian, put him in the closet, and broke into the data center again. I've now not only not addressed my culture issue, I've put human lives at risk. Do you think I might have been a little falsely confident with my 5-inch lock and yeah. The hard lesson was I had to, at 24 years old, stand in front of the board of Verizon and explain why we'd put human lives at risk. And how were we going to change our culture so that every person, from the janitor to the security guard, to our security teams, understood why we needed to change. And for me, it forced me to become a leader at understanding that every person in an organization has a role to play. And as a CISO, that's why transforming to be able to explain security is so important at a board perspective. So how do we do all this now that I've told you my story? Anyone else want to go walk roofs of data centers in Scotland Yard when they're 24? Trust me, you're not paid enough. I was like $20,000 a year at that point. It was bad. The way to start educating your board and transforming how we work is understanding your past is the key to a future. So when I work with boards to talk about security, I break things into 3 zones. You have the zone of routine, the zone of surprise, and the zone of catastrophe. So the zone of routine is, this is the security we need year on year to anticipate the threats we know are going to happen. We're going to have some malware. We need a firewall. We need to make sure that we have an IDS and IPS. It's the base level. This is what's going to keep the regulators away. This is what we're going to do to make sure that everything's safe. MFA, whatever we need, our computer software, this and that. That's your zone of routine. What are you expecting to happen? That's easy for a board to understand. The second piece is the zone of surprise. Based on what happened in the last 12 months, we saw our #1 competitor have this type of a breach. We were not anticipating a supply chain attack where something like SolarWinds happens. We saw this type of thing happen in the industry. We should prepare as well. It's educating the board of what is coming that we know about that we should start planning for as we speak today. The third piece really depends on your business. That's the zone of catastrophe. Those are the black swans. So if something like what we just saw happen at Uber, what's been going on with Twitter, what we've seen with some of the big name memory maker hacks the last year, are we primed? Is our company exposed where there could be a catastrophe? And should we plan for that? Is there something potentially that could cause one of the area risk towers, operational, reputational? Is there something we should be thinking about and preparing for that could hurt our business to that magnitude? I'm going to ask the audience for a second. On the zone of catastrophe, take out the Fortune 1000. If there's a catastrophic breach, how long before a company goes out of business? Anyone want to venture a guess? On average. What did you say?
3 days.
3 days? Close. 48 hours. 48 hours. Now, when you think about that, CISA just actually expanded critical national infrastructure to 16 designations. Only 15% of the companies designated are in the Fortune 1000. Which means 85% of the companies listed as critical national infrastructure now are small to mid businesses that have the potential to go out of business in 48 hours. So do you think having a board understand this is important? Yeah. Or your CEO, or whoever's making decisions. But here's the problem. We're Snoopy talking. Do you think the average person is going to understand red team, blue team, IDS, IPS, zero trust? No. So how do you make it into their language? Well, you have to put it into dollars and cents. You have to be able to do it from a quantification perspective. So in this year, what are the chances that your losses are going to exceed this level? Here's your zone of routine. If we have a breach that's going to impact the zone of routine, if you don't put in the firewalls, it's going to cost you 10x of your million revenue. This is actually fairly easy if you work with your CFO, if you work with your controllers, your financial people to understand. If, using your tables, if you do X or don't have X, here's the percentage likelihood the breach is going to happen, and here's what the impact to the business is. Now we're starting to speak on a board level language. If we don't put in the zones, here is the cost, the investment, what is the loss, and what would happen on an infrequent high impact. And is there an exposure level high enough that could put our business out of business? So if you take what we use from a language perspective and work with your counterparts to actually put it into dollars and cents and align it to a register, all of a sudden, guess what? We're starting to meet in the middle, and have a common understanding of the actual dollars of risk. And guess what? I'm not talking cyber anymore. Did you hear me? We're talking about risk. So from the quantification, then it becomes a lot easier, risk plus probability, to actually put together a business register. So as a board of directors, some of the things I talk about when we're actually looking at an organization is, what is our M&A activity, continuity, strategic directives, all sorts of different things, regulatory. That's the language a board understands. And what we can do is overlay, with data being the #1 priority, the different areas of security that we're going to need, whether we're looking from an infrastructure perspective, a cloud perspective, assets, subsidiary data, where we need to invest and spend money. This is something a board can understand, a CEO can understand, and we can work together to see, is it covered? Should we plan for it? Is it not in scope? Or should we be continuing to assess it? All of a sudden, we have the CISO, here's the IDS, the IPS, all the acronyms we love, zero trust, you name it, and the board, fiduciary risk, operational risk, reputational risk, strategy, coming together in one common plane and picture. This is really important, because am I talking about a cyber threat? No. I've taken those threats and moved them over to the area of strategic directives and the language that boards have been speaking, C-levels have been speaking, like I said, for hundreds of years. Makes it a lot easier from a common plane. But the key thing to remember is, what is the most important thing in all of this? There's a big word here, guys. Data. Remember that employee attack surface? What are we going after? Data. Here's the scariest part about data. Guess what? We all got to go back to school on data too. 83% of organizations protect the wrong data. Let me say that again. 83% of organizations protect the wrong data. The concept of crown jewels, the concept of what your critical data is, almost always is wrong. True story. About 6 years ago, got a call from a good friend of mine who's the CISO of a very large consumer packaged good company, and he said, Kate, the board wants to meet and they want to bring in some experts on what we should be doing to protect our crown jewels. Would you come in and just listen and give me an assessment? I'm like, absolutely, let's go have some fun. So I went and I met with the board. It was a lot of fun. Lots of men in very big suits, and thank you very much. They thought I actually was there to serve coffee. I had to explain, no, I'm actually the security person, but thank you. I'd love a cup of coffee too. And they were explaining to me that their recipes were their crown jewels. Large, one of the top consumer packaged good companies. They make almost every product. In fact, I would almost guarantee there's about 10 of them in this room right now. Recipes, yeah, that's important. Nobody else can know their recipes, right? I want to see a couple head nods. Yeah. When we did the analysis, 5,000 plus employees a day had access to their recipes. They were absolutely unprotectable. From the warehousemen to the workers on the lines to the plants in China, everybody knew these recipes. They were spending $10+ million a year protecting data that was absolutely unprotectable. What were their crown jewels? Remember that last slide, the M&A activity? Their strategic directions? Yeah, that was all pretty much sitting in email files and a couple of drop boxes that there was no protection around. So understanding your data, what are your crown jewels? And how are they being accessed from an application, a user, a workload, and a flow perspective? Do we actually know who has access to them? Can we discover that? Is it doing the right thing? And are we able to control it? So another true story. I spent a couple of years at a great company called vArmor. And Our ability to understand and control and look at data, and from this perspective, discover, observe, control, that's really what we did. And I was in Asia, and I was working with a bank, and another friend of mine, a CISO, was taking a look and doing some work with me on a new product, and he's like, all right, let's throw the solution in, we'll take a look. So we did. About 2 weeks worth of data. I showed it up on the screen, and he looked at me and he's like, Kate, there's a bug. I mean, what do you mean there's a bug? He goes, there's a bug. There's no way that that data is flowing in that direction, because that would mean it's coming out of the network. And I'm like, well, maybe there's a bug. I'm like, I don't know, I think we might still have it live. So we popped it up, yep, still live. And he's looking at the relationships, and he's like, well, but that guy would never have access to that. And he's looking again, and he's kind of talking to himself, and he's like, that application shouldn't be going there, that workflow. And all of a sudden he stopped, and he's like, hey, I gotta go, I'll call you tomorrow. Meeting's over. And I'm like, okay. We'd caught in-progress data theft. We watched data come out because literally there was a back door, you're going to love this, in a mobile banking app that was attached to an HR system. And a disgruntled employee had figured out how to exfiltrate data and was selling it to a really interesting conglomerate. Understanding, discover, observe, control. So if you can understand where your data is going, then you have the power to educate that C-suite and do all those things we just talked about. Zone of routine, zone of surprise, make your wheel, get everything done. But the key is that you're not going to do this alone. Whoop, come on. There we go. Your C-suite has power. The walls and the silos are tumbling down. AppSec, DevSec, all the different secs, your different teams, everybody has power to help. How is your data being used? How do you reduce cost? Can you block access? Can you break down your usage from a personal and a business perspective? Do you really understand shadow IT and your policies? Legal, expense, regulatory, and even HR are some of our best friends when it comes to this type of work. And if we can align from a collaboration standpoint, and I'm not saying it's easy. I was talking with a CISO in the government earlier this week, and I asked, what's your biggest problem with zero trust? And guess what he said? My HR lead. Not tech, not anything else, HR. But if we can get the C-suite to help, all of a sudden, making that common language becomes really easy. And then we're able to really make that transformation that cyber risk is nothing more than business risk. You got the horizontal relationships, your users, your apps, your data, your devices, your infrastructure, your storage. Let me say that again. We live in the land of securing devices, infrastructure, storage. But our business looks at it from a user, application, and data perspective. So if we can all of a sudden take cyber and make it a business service, and then think about not only the horizontal, but the vertical, all of a sudden this is one common area we understand together. Makes a lot of sense, right? Yeah. Business risk is the language that boards have been speaking on for 100 years. If we can make the transformation that cyber actually lives in all areas of risk. The only area of risk I see it doesn't live in is climate, because until Abby's a little older and figures out how to make a computer that can control the sun, I think we're good on climate. But everything else, operational, what else did we say? Regulatory, reputational, every other area of risk, there is a cyber component. So if we can make it a business risk, guess what? We're golden. We stop sounding like Snoopy. And that journey we go on goes from a maturity journey to a digital journey. We can work with the business on what their challenges are, which, guess what, have everything to do about selling more stuff, being better in the marketplace, not about zero trust and secure. We can understand the assets that are going to make and impact that challenge. How do we secure them? What are the risks with those challenges? How do we create advanced cyber that augments the business? What controls will we need? And how are we going to continue it from an evergreen perspective? But we all start then on a common plane with the business. Understanding the needs, identifying the assets, leveraging the mitigation, using the detection necessary, and then uplift and modifying as needed. We create a different type of a never-ending journey that allows us to work together versus trying to pull each other apart. So to end, I'm a very simple person. Like I said, I got 5 kids. I don't have time for a lot of complexity in my life. The reality is, if we go back to the basics, risk plus cost equals security, that will be the foundation of how we transform as CISOs. Any questions? No questions? Mike's up here looking and looking. Richard. So the question was, your analysis is phenomenal, thank you. Why do we still have problems? I think it's a question that, to your point, the evolution of the CISO, and if we look at the last 10 years, we're all technologists, first and foremost. But as risk has changed, we've had to really expand and grow to become business people as well, and understanding the language of a board. And that's a hard shift. My own journey, and I'll talk about it for a minute, is, like I said, I was a salesperson. I became a technologist out of, in essence, force. I should have been a technologist all along. I actually bribed an IT major down the hall from me in college to teach me about frame relay. I might have called bandwidth bandwidth on my first interview, like a sandwich, like a sandwich, like a sandwich. And I didn't know that security and IT could be a thing. I'm that old. So I started out in technology because a very, very nice engineer took pity on me and would make me go to brown bag lunches to learn all about tech. And then I ended up going back to school for technology and engineering a lot later in my life. But when I was a CISO, I was really frustrated about the lack of understanding in the industry about how we work with early stage startups, looking at businesses, creating innovation, doing things in a holistic manner. And so I went on a search for meaning, where I stepped away from being a practitioner for 5 years to work with early stage, to work with late stage, to go through the journey of what's it like to take a company public, what's it like to be a CEO, what do you mean when you have to build alliances. So I very purposefully kind of stepped through a bunch of different changes so that I could be prepared to stand on boards, to understand different aspects. And now we're asking our industry to go through that same, in essence, 6-year search for meaning in a couple of courses. And so I think, Richard, it's going to come with time. But it's hard to all of a sudden go from, you saw me on Hacker Jeopardy last night. It's been a lot of years since I coded on a Linux box, dear God, or done anything on that level. And I did know who Grace Hopper was, and I actually used to go to Bletchley Park, and I know who Colossus is, but you go away from that mode. And so kind of bridging that gap between the two is something we all need to work on. Next question. Mm-hmm.
My question is, no matter how much you do that, how do you secure the most simple access as a data user?
So the question was, we go through a lot of things and we talked about the breaches and the threats, but how do you, at the most simple point, secure the end user? And everyone's laughing. The reality is one of the biggest issues we have is culture. Culture, culture, culture. We all force our employees to go through security training. We all force our employees to click on the box that you've done your annual assessment. But guess what? I can fly through those in like 10 minutes. Do I read any of it? No. Does anyone? No. So, and remember that whole thing in the beginning of the maturity model, you got denial and then maybe a little bit of worry until it happens to you? We have to do a better job of putting security from a culture level into our organizations so that people realize it's not a question of, are you going to be breached? It's a when. And that privacy, it was fascinating. I did a talk at RSA a couple years ago about the extinction of privacy. One of my favorite mentors, Vince Cerf, put out a pretty controversial quote that privacy was extinct. So I did a tabletop at RSA about it to understand. Guess how many people showed up to hear about it, whether privacy was extinct? One. The concept of privacy, to your point, is still very visceral in the United States. And so people just assume they have it. So until we change the culture, we're going to continue to have issues with the layman end user. Yep.
Great presentation. It's been fantastic. If we have a sort of an issue, it's all around the culture, right? For us to go in and say our users are our biggest risk because they are the attack surface. When you go talk to the board, the users are our biggest cost and biggest asset. And you have to find a way to bridge that. We're not looking at somebody who's saying users are bad when they're going, users are what I need. And that's part of the culture thing. And how do you address that at the board level so that they buy into the fact that yes, users are our biggest asset and our biggest risk. And how do we change culture to change that reality?
So you take it from a financial perspective. So does anyone know the average cost to onboard an employee today and maintain an employee in a normal organization like a Fortune 20 or 2,500? Anyone know? $37,000. $37,000. So every person in this room is roughly worth $37,000 in onboarding cost in your first year. Now, you multiply that times sometimes 10, hundreds, thousands, that becomes a very meaningful number to a board. So if you can tell a board that, look, you know, you have a $37,000 sunk cost in every individual, and you have a risk exposure of if there is a breach, the average cost of a breach is about $1 million at this point on a minor breach, and it's only going to cost you $2,600 per employee to put together a comprehensive culture program. Guess what they're going to do? They're going to implement it. So it's putting it down to the numbers that every company has a pretty high cost to actually put an employee in, irregardless if it's the janitor or a C-level, and protecting that cost by creating and implementing a culture that makes security first is critical. True story on that. I'll tell a funny story about British Telecom. So and this goes to, who's been to SnoopCon in Birmingham? Anyone? Birmingham in the UK? Awesome, it's the BT con. And when we were acquiring EE, there were a group of us who decided to see if we could hack our own company. God, it was fun. So we hacked EE. And we utilized social engineering, we utilized a lot of different things. And by the end of it, we had cameras into the SOC, we'd broken in through air shafts, we might have used Wi-Fi sniffers on trains, and stolen ID cards. But we showed how far we could get into an organization exploiting average employees. Not the security guys, not the tech, the printer salesmen, the janitors, the secretaries. Yeah, we had a lot of fun. But we pointed fun at ourselves because what we showed was that by not educating and creating a comprehensive culture, we were at risk at our highest crown jewels, our employee data in the SOC. So it's those type of exercises of doing a tabletop to show why it's important, and then the average sunk cost, it becomes very easy to get a board to change those decisions. Any more questions? All right, I think I'm out of time, guys. Cheers.